what I'm going to be doing is covering two areas, basically, and I'm going to be flip-flopping back and forth between them. One is what I would call a new science of consciousness, and I'm going to be writing tonight some. New science of consciousness. I think I spelled that right. We're going to be talking about that, the fact that science across the board, yeah, come on, bring my friend up. This is the original Lapis Pig. He's a character in tonight's performance. And the other is a ring that was materialized by Sai Baba. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So anyway, new science of consciousness and the needs of the planet Earth. Needs or for the Earth. Because if we really look at what's going on, I think you don't have to be a rocket scientist to understand the fact that the Earth, our species, if you look at the Earth as one consciousness, as one superorganism, this is the so-called Gaia hypothesis, then it's pretty evident that we as a species have been running rampant and raping this planet and acting cancerously upon its surface, and that we're going to have to change our ways. That's the bad news. The good news is that there exists waiting in the wings some of the tools of consciousness to solve those problems. And I think in a way, you know, contemporary metaphysics is teaching us how to raise our consciousness as individuals, how to heal ourselves, how the power of prayer can really bring in abundance and health and all of that good stuff. And but there's also our collective consciousness. And what I want to point out tonight is that there have been some remarkable experiments, well-controlled scientific experiments, that prove beyond any reasonable doubt that not only does consciousness as a unifying force exist, but also it provides those very tools we need to solve global problems. Now, Einstein one time said, no problem can be solved from the same consciousness that created it. And the problems we have created are absolutely enormous. If we use the old tools to solve these problems, I don't think that's going to be enough. I think it's going to be too little, too late. So if we continue burning oil like it's going out of style, if we continue going to war to fight for oil, if oil prices are actually less than Perrier prices, if we continue expanding our oil consumption worldwide as we've been doing, doubling that consumption every 10 to 15 years, we're only going to have enough oil left on the planet for about another 40 years, and then that's it, folks. In the 58 years I've been alive on this planet, about half of all of the known oil reserves have already been used. We're now going to the North Slope of Alaska to drill for a little more oil to get the United States another half a year of supply, wiping out the last caribou sanctuary on the North Slope, the Serengeti of North America. Of course, some things are legendary, like supertanker spills. We have the grid system. I mean, try to look outside anywhere without a wire, and that's pretty hard to find. I think that when we look back on the 20th century, and we're well into the 21st century, one of my predictions is that we're going to look back upon this century as a century of incredible pollution and suppression of alternatives, that it will have been considered as a dark age in many ways. But I also see it as a century in which information and disinformation has flowed much more efficiently, and there are these centers of light. So we're kind of like on this accelerator, and we're headed either toward an Armageddon, which I don't think is true. I agree with Joseph Campbell on that. I think it's more that the apocalypse is not Armageddon, but it's the fact that our ignorance and our complacence are both coming to an end. And so we're going to talk about these two and go back and forth between them. I don't think that people have really adequately addressed some of these questions. We seem to want to apply consciousness to us as individuals, but maybe not so much for our environment. Now, the last 7 years or so, I've lived either in the Cascade Mountains near Ashland, Oregon, or on Maui. The last 5 months, I lived in Hana, which is way on the east end of Maui. And in that kind of sensitivity that I developed living in places like that, you know, all of a sudden I was cast back into the megalopolis. And whoa, what a culture shock that was for me. Maybe those of you that live in the city don't notice it as much because you're here all the time. But Dennis Weaver has a nice analogy to that. It's called the frog in the pond. And this was an experiment some scientists did once. It was a kind of cruel experiment, but it was one in which a frog was put in this little bath of water, and they gradually raised the temperature just a little bit each day until the temperature in the pond or the bath got so hot the frog couldn't get out of it. The frog didn't notice any big increment. There were little baby steps along the way until it was too late. There are people like Dennis Hayes, World Watch Institute, which even Congress uses as a source. In the State of the World, he said that we have about 10 years left to reverse the rampant pollution that we're creating on the Earth. The statistics are truly alarming. Two Yale University economists recently, and this was reported in CNN News about a month ago, calculated that the average human being in the developed world consumes $100,000 irreversibly of Earth's resources, which amounts to 30% of the gross domestic product. In other words, this is irreversible pollution. This is the ecological cost of a human being living a lifetime here in the developed world. In the underdeveloped world, it seems ironic when you go to the underdeveloped world, you say, my God, the pollution's even worse there. In some ways it is, the air pollution and so forth, but in some ways it isn't. But this figure is actually very low, 30% of the gross domestic product, because it doesn't include the effects of global warming, the El Nino effect, which is rampant. We'll get to that a little bit later, but there's one theory, and it's a theory that I'm looking at very carefully as a scientist, is that a number of atmospheric scientists now believe that the El Nino is caused or triggered by global warming, which in turn is triggered by the routine burning of fossil fuels, of which carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere and the greenhouse effect in the atmosphere warms it up and creates this irreversible effect, which we may now already be into. It's rather scary news that if we were to stop burning our fossil fuels right away and convert to a free energy economy, which I'll be talking about in a little while, and we did it right away, it would still be about one human generation before the effects can be balanced. It takes the Earth a while to adjust to a new set of circumstances. And some scientists and others have glibly stated that, well, now what's the big deal here? The Earth is warming up, that's great. That means some of the more temperate places will get warmer and the U.S. continent will be more like Hawaii. But that's not the way it works, folks. The Earth is much more complex than that. And we now are seeing that in the El Nino effect, which really is, it seems innocent enough. It's a warm spot in the South Pacific that, like in a bucket, sloshes eastward off the coast of South America. And in that action, it creates a whole new set of weather conditions locally, pretty much all over the Western Hemisphere and even into the Eastern Hemisphere. And the thing about this that's not so good is that one of the nonlinear effects of global warming or the El Nino is that in a lot of areas you have drought followed by severe monsoon conditions. For example, about 2 years ago, after an El Nino season, central India had unprecedented high temperatures and a drought, and then the monsoon came in. And because of these very unusual conditions, many bubonic plague and dengue fever mosquitoes bred under these conditions. And because of the warmer atmosphere, the inversion layers were higher and the disease vectors could spread like tens of times more efficiently, which caused an outbreak of bubonic plague in India and killed a few hundred people. Well, that could be nothing compared to what might happen in the future in terms of, for example, in the Amazon basin, the mosquitoes that are bred there, yellow fever and so forth, are now reaching Texas because of global warming. So you see, global warming is more than just the mean temperature of the Earth rising 1 degree, and yeah, we've got a few more degrees to go before the ice caps melt and the sea level rises and all the coastal areas are inundated. That's one negative scenario. But what I'm saying is that there are a lot of nonlinear effects, such as the efficient spread of airborne disease and other things in the El Nino itself, which is unprecedented Its intensity is unprecedented in all of recorded history. And now some scientists are even suggesting that it's unprecedented in geological history going back thousands of years. And so this is serious business. And yet, you see in the news, we hear every night, we're bombarded with El Nino, El Nino, El Nino. It does this, it does that. Mudslides, tornadoes, ice storms, cherry blossoms in February in Washington. But we don't hear about what it is doing in the long run and what might be causing it. Now, El Nino may not be caused by the routine burning of fossil fuels. It may turn out to be some sort of other, more, quote, natural explanation. But it should at least give us a warning bell that we are entering a very dangerous period in human history, that we're entering a period in which we have to change our ways. We have no choice but to change our ways. And the principal component to the global warming, to air pollution, to the supertanker spills, to the grid system that we're involving here, is the burning of fossil fuels, coal and oil, particularly oil. If you look at the New York Stock Exchange, an incredibly high percentage, I've heard somewhere between 50 and 80%, depending on how you do it, of the money that's being invested in the stock exchange is into energy, existing energy sources, whether it be a utility or an oil company or some other type of energy company, nuclear power companies. That plus the military-industrial complex, which make the weapons of war, and the booming computer and information revolution, those are the folks that are bringing us money. But the problem is the money is getting diverted into areas that aren't really helpful to our economy. Now, I don't want to be too negative, and we'll get back to some of this environmental stuff. The good news about all of this, of course, is that we're ready to move into a whole new era. Now, when I was in India a few years ago, I purchased this thing called a Lapis Pig. Here he is. This is the original Lapis Pig. And my partner, Meredith Miller, about 5 or 6 years ago, after I brought him back, appointed him as guardian of our treasury. And by the way, the treasury's been in deep trouble ever since, and I think you'll understand why. He was appointed guardian of the treasury. I also brought back from this trip a beautiful ring, which was manifested, or appeared to be manifested out of thin air by Sai Baba. This is a ring that almost looks like a diamond. I don't think it is. If it were, gee, maybe I can cash it in and the treasury is no more problems. But at any rate, he waved his hands a few feet from my face and this beautiful ring appeared. So I brought both of these back from the same trip, but the Lapis Pig began to develop his own personality. And he became my alter ego. He became all of those things I wanted to let go of in the old paradigm, the paradigm of materialism, the paradigm of Western science. And I began to think about how our thinking systems have changed and how they're still quite rigid. I love this Bertrand Russell quote, the English philosopher, late philosopher Bertrand Russell one time. He said, the resistance to a new idea increases as the square of its importance. And the ideas that we're talking about here are so important that most people ignore them because they're almost too scary to embrace. But it's what we would kind of call consciousness. But meanwhile, since the time of Descartes, about 300 years ago, we have created a belief system for ourselves in the culture that we sometimes called objective, there's great words here, objective materialism. And we can use these words interchangeably. So another word would be reductionism. These are the features of what we would call Western science. And around 300 years ago, Descartes, based on some of Newton's concepts and ideas, felt that all of reality could be explained in terms of its component parts. In other words, if you divided matter into the tiniest little bit or piece, then that piece would then pervade all of matter, and that there would be certain immutable physical laws, such as gravity and electromagnetics, that this matter would obey in an objective materialistic universe, which means that an observer could be dispassionately watching what's going on and very predictably find out what's going to happen in the future. That another word for that is determinism. So these are all the isms which constitute what we call Western science. And what's happened is that we've created this box for ourselves. I sometimes like to think of the box as limited in time and space. So you have the time axis going here and the space axis going here. And you have very, very severe boundaries. In other words, inquiry into anything outside the box is tantamount to heresy. Now, this has happened throughout all of history. It happened in the time of the Renaissance when Galileo and Copernicus came along. And that's when everybody thought that the Earth was at the center of everything and that everything revolved around the Earth. And now we're talking about something that's very different. We're talking about now a belief system in which human beings being at the center of everything, and in their world, we call that anthropocentrism. I'm going to write all these wonderful words, these isms. Anthropocentrism, which means basically that we are at the top of the cosmic pecking order, and we are the dominant species not only in this planet but in the universe, and we know best, and we can just run rampant over the planet, and there are no superior intelligences. We're just, that's anthropocentrism. 300, 400 years ago, it was geocentrism. In other words, the Earth was the center of the universe. All the stars and planets revolved around the Earth. The problem was that scientists were trying to construct these extremely complicated formalisms. Ptolemy did in the Greek times, that all the orbits of the planets around the Earth, if the Earth were hypothesized as being at the center of everything, then you'd have to have, like, the orbit of Mars would be in a cycle, go into an epicycle, and then an epi-epicycle, and then all these epicycles. And the mathematics would occupy people during their entire lives to try to figure out how the heck the planets all go around the Earth. And then along comes Copernicus, who on his deathbed, and he waited until he was on his deathbed to do this, for fear he'd be roasted. And he said, no, the sun's at the center of everything. The Earth goes around the sun. And then everything fell out and was quite clarified. Well, I think we're going through a time like that now, except now our disease is anthropocentrism, but also this concept that we as objective observers can watch the universe unfold like a gigantic mechanical clock deterministically, and that we can in fact find out how this behavior happens using certain immutable forces of physics. There are 4 forces that physicists know of, electromagnetic, gravity, strong nuclear binding forces, and weak atomic forces. And a lot of physicists think that's all there is. If we can only unify those 4 known forces, then in a way, all we have to do is go back to the hypothesized primordial Big Bang 15 billion years ago and deterministically find out what's happened ever since then. But what's in fact actually happening here is, you see, through quantum mechanics, quantum physics, we're learning, and we have been learning now for well over a generation, that the act of observation creates the result that happens. And this has caused a lot of physicists to really be disturbed. And in fact, what the physicists like to do is they've fallen into different schools, and they call these things anomalies. And now I think it's time to introduce the Lapis Pig. And because this one is so small, I decided to create a bigger one. This one was created by Jim Henson's Creature Shop. And so he's going to now introduce himself to you and give his opinion.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Prudence dictates the following procedures. Number 1, there's no monies in investigations outside the box, and there's no interest in it whatsoever. And moreover, there is no sense in observing anything that's not objective or materialistic. In my most esteemed opinion, I would like to point out that there is no such thing as perpetual motion. nor is there any such thing as consciousness. Because the late Carl Sagan said so.
Billions of times.
It is my most diligent opinion that we should snuff out any efforts appropriated toward outside the box because they're at best only anomalies.
So that's a Lapis Pig, and he's my alter ego. He's that part of me that I want to let go of. And about 20 years ago, when I was at Princeton, acting like a good Lapis Pig professor, every other Tuesday at the Joseph Henry luncheons, we would swill thimblefuls of sherry and talk about how ridiculous claims to the paranormal were, until I had a paranormal experience myself, a remote viewing experience where I was able to tune into somebody psychically, and then I didn't know what to do because I was in the closet at that point. And then I kind of dipped my toe into the metaphysical pond, just a little bit here and there. And as time went on, I would try out this, try out that. I'd become a workshop junkie in the weekends. Can you identify with that? You go to this and learn this and healing and near-death. I had a near-death experience in an automobile accident. So little by little, I was going into the metaphysical pond and going outside this box that we're talking about, which we could say this is our accepted reality, and by our, I mean by the rules of Western science. And I say, thank God there are people like Harry Moses and the New Thought Center that says, well, now wait a minute. This so-called objective, materialistic, reductionistic, deterministic, anthroponistic, that this is at best a limiting case of reality. And it's the case of reality that applies to certain ranges of phenomena that are observed in the laboratory and in real life. But what's happened is that we have bought this box hook, line, and sinker. So for example, one would use this boundary as maybe our birth. In other words, any kind of conjecture or inquiry about life before birth, such as reincarnation or the existence of a soul that may have preceded our embodiment as human beings here, is considered taboo in a court of scientific inquiry. And then death, of course, after death, a near-death experience, according to mainstream scientists, is just a hallucinatory, release of serotonin, and that's that. And then, when we're dead, the lights are out, there is no more, you can go home now. And in fact, actually, if you take all of these things lumped in and then add on top of it this thing called entropy, that's a very gloomy view. That's an Armageddon-type view of the universe, which suggests that the universe is gradually winding down, and that, in fact, there will be no energy left in the universe whatsoever. And that these four known forces of physics is all there is, and that physics consists of these billiard ball little components, atoms, and then they were little particles that comprise the atoms, and they're quarks that consume the particles, that consume the atoms. That all of these things go around bouncing into one another aimlessly and randomly, and that we are just kind of accidents of nature, we humans, and animals are too, and animals are inferior. You kind of get it. This is the Western world as such as we know it. In the space axis, we haven't accepted the concept of non-human or extraterrestrial intelligence. I sometimes put that up here and just say it's only us. Down here we have such things as psychokinesis, remote viewing, healing, prayer, spoon bending. Hey, I got a spoon here, maybe. Anyway, all of these things are things that lie outside the box of Western science. And try to get approval of a curriculum or try to get $1 of federal funding for anything outside the box. The buck stops here. All these you can draw dollar signs all on the boundaries of the box. And here we have been just kind of aimlessly going in this direction with little or no sense of ethics, and with political leadership and media mouthpieces and academic practices all being geared toward inside the box. as we go lickety-split into the 21st century with increased pollution and so forth. So you kind of begin to get the picture here, is that this ain't where it's at. Now, the Lapis Pig thinks it is, and is very vindictive about those who think it isn't that way. And I have to create this character within me because it happens without me. I was at Caltech last weekend, and there's a difference of opinion between some of the professors and myself about some of these matters. And I say again, thank God for these centers of light of where metaphysics is being studied, and where metaphysics and physics are now coming closer and closer and closer. And of course, I mentioned yesterday in the service that Ernest Holmes, the very first sentence in Science of Mind is that we all look forward to the day when science and religion walk hand in hand through the visible into the invisible. And it's sort of in a way, during this dark age of a century where we now seem to be focused on Armageddon and there's no hope and there's, that we are now on the threshold of looking at solutions which are based on consciousness. Now I got a spoon here. How many of you were at my spoon bending workshop here a few years ago?
How many have bent spoons is the question.
And how many of you bent spoons? Yeah, for your diploma. Yeah, that's great. Because in the spoon bending workshops that I teach, about 90% of the people that attempt to do it are able to do so where there's a significant mind-matter component. Now, the Lapis Pig would think that it's just simply force that I use. I'm not a graduate of spoon bending 401. I'm a graduate of 101. And what that means is that I have to use a little bit of force to initiate the bending process. But spoon bending is really very simple. It's one of these like credential role reversal situations. In other words, the more credentialed you are, the probably less likely you are to be able to do it successfully. And especially middle-aged intellectual men have great trouble with this. I one time led a group to Australia, and it was 13 of us, and 2 of us couldn't do it. And they were both men, and one of them was a congressman from Michigan, and the other one was an engineer from Massachusetts, and they were both in their 50s. It's really a very simple process, and as you'll learn from Marlene Oakes, one of the approaches to it, and it was her approach to it, is called Aikido, the Japanese martial art, which involves the use of energy in the human body that will be applied toward bending the spoon. So what I'm going to be doing in this spoon, by the way, I'm going to maybe 5 or 6 of you can kind of try flexing it. You can see this is a pretty thick-handled spoon. And what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to do a few breaths. I'm going to breathe a little bit and start the Aikido forces going up. Now, Aikido means I means harmony of the universe or energy in the universe. And we'll be talking about that universal energy very shortly because this energy is totally contradictory. Its existence is totally contradictory to the precepts of Western science such as we know it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But we know that this universal energy is present. We know this, and so a group like this, I don't have to convince you. There have been several, I'm sure, how many of you had the experience of either using prayer or treatment to create a result you want on this planet in the material world? So, yeah, so there we go. And even 2 hands go up sometimes, and that's, an underscore that we know that this can happen even though it's not told to us in the schools because that smacks of religion. And by the way, that's another problem that we've created for ourselves. When we separated church and state, the church is kind of separated into other churches, and there were all these different boxes, each one representing a particular belief system that was rather parochial. But to really understand metaphysics, we have to have a bigger box that embraces all of the above. Why not bring in all of the evidence that can come to bear to build this new paradigm of science and spirit? So now, where's that spoon? I guess we've just about all of you have handled it. And this is not a trick spoon, as you can see. It's a pretty thick-handled spoon. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing a few breaths here, and you might want to do a close-up of this because this is going to really heat up pretty soon. And what I'm going to do is do a few breath cycles, and with each breath I'm going to visualize the I, AI, the harmony and energy of the universe going through the top of my head to my power spot, which is just a little above my belly button. This is the so-called power chakra. And that's when I breathe in. Then when I breathe out, I'm going to visualize that transformed energy, the key, the life energy, which has been brought in, if you will, and I'll bring it into the spoon. I'll extend my key into the spoon. And do means I key do, do means doing it. And so what I'm going to do is basically become at one with the spoon as I'm breathing, and I'm going to visualize the spoon softening as I'm breathing. And usually what happens is that after I do that a little bit, and after I plant the intention to bend the spoon, then a spoon bending launch window opens up. Usually a few tenths of a second after the intention is planted. And at that point, I'll stop breathing and I'm going to start yelling, bend, 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 bend. And I'm going to ask that you also yell bend, 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 because with your support, it will make the job a little easier. And we'll see what happens. Usually, the launch window opens up, and then a second or two after it opens up, it slams shut just as fast as it opens. And the spoon resolidifies. And that's because the Lapis Pig within says, finally when it catches up to the mind, the Lapis Pig says,
this is a trick spoon, and you used force. There is nothing to spoon bending. It is total poppycock.
That's what the skeptics think, I've had Randy the magician say that I was bending spoon just so I could get the girls all happy. So here we go. So here is this very strong, solid spoon. Just occurred to me, some of you might think that when I had the pig up, I switched the spoons. So that's solid. That's pretty solid, isn't it? Yeah, that's cool. All right. And by the way, little old ladies and kids do much better in spoon bending than we guys. Bend, 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 bend. There we go. Bent spoon. It's still pretty hot there. There, you can pass that out around the audience. So we can all do that, and it happens like that, and then it just stops happening. Like then the window is open like for about a half a second, and then the Lapis Pig within just totally quashed me. And that's what actually happens. That's the process. And by the way, this is interesting because I'm going to England shortly. How many of you ever heard of the crop circles? Yes. Yeah. They're a fascinating phenomenon. And this is where the wheat stalks in the wheat fields of England, especially in Wiltshire, but it's actually all over the world, they bend at right angles and swirl in this very rich tapestry and making all sorts of symbols that are quite fascinating. Making sacred geometries, fish, dolphins, celestial symbols, all sorts of interesting symbols that no two people can agree what the source is, besides the fact that it's extremely eclectic and very sophisticated. Sort of like some cosmic artist leprechaun has learned somehow how to bend over all these wheat stalks, temporarily melt them at their base, and then they bend down, and then they re-solidify and grow horizontally. Now, Doug and Dave, notwithstanding, these are two gentlemen in their 60s that hang out in a pub and claim they did all the crop circles, and that was on Dan Rather's CBS Evening News. Case dismissed. That, of course, won't hold water. The fact is that there is some process, some application of consciousness that's creating these things. And I think it's very similar to the spoon bending, except a little more sophisticated than what I just did. Even more sophisticated than Uri Geller, some of those folks, because we're talking here literally billions and billions of wheat stalks that bend over and form these very elegant tapestries and different sorts of textures and shapes. And this year the theme seems to be puzzles. So we're going to go over to England and look at the crop circles, and sometimes when you dowse inside a crop circle, we're going to do a little dowsing a little later, the scientists or the people, the investigators find very unusual energies. And one time the dowsing rods that I had inside a crop circle went around like the blade of a helicopter. And So these kinds of phenomena that you call, whether it's spoon bending or that, are I consider examples of the application of consciousness that violate the rules and regulations of Western science, such as we know them, the Lapis Pig notwithstanding. So what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about how consciousness is just the latest rage in the academic disciplines. Yes, academia is finally beginning to catch up with metaphysics. What I'd like to talk about first is a little bit, I'm going to give you a little summary on this thing we call free energy, because it's a very important concept. Free energy is one word for it. Another word is zero-point energy, meaning that this hypothesized energy field exists even at temperatures of absolute zero. And it turns out, oh yeah, come on up. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and if you want to clean it while I'm talking, that's good too. Thank you. Thank you. You're Eric, aren't you? Yeah, thanks, Eric. The concept is now being looked at by physicists and published in the peer-reviewed literature. That some theoretical physicists have actually now come up with a formulation for what we call zero-point energy. And basically, what's involved here is a concept called the zero-point field. This field is a homogeneous, meaning the same everywhere, an isotropic, meaning the same in all directions, energy field, which must be invoked to explain a lot of quantum phenomena that physicists, such as, for example, that electrons, when they radiate away energy, they still vibrate. So there has to be some energy force field that keeps the electrons vibrating. Well, it turns out, according to these theoretical physicists, that if you accelerate an electromagnetic charge, and by accelerate I mean it could be a rotary motion, that's an acceleration, that's nonlinear. It could be a resonance, that's sort of motion, like what Eric is doing right now. And you notice energy coming out of there? I mean, there's energy coming off the spoon, so that's possible. And so these approaches are all parallel approaches to the same problem, namely that if you accelerate an electromagnetic charge in the presence of the field, then you can tap it. Now, some physicists, John Archibald Wheeler, for example, the Nobel laureate, suggested that there is enough energy in a tiny point in time-space to evaporate all of the Earth's oceans, enough potential energy. It's an absolute vast energy source. It is absolutely enormous compared to anything we do now. And what we've been doing up until this point is that we have blindly felt and thought that the only thing that exists in the form of energy has to be to waste something or to use something that we actually see, touch, feel, or hear, like burning a fuel, like a fossil fuel, coal or oil, or nuclear fuel, or even using the sun or windmills. I mean, they're renewable sources, but they also, to a degree, pollute, and they also are expensive. So that has never really grabbed hold. But meanwhile, since the time actually of Michael Faraday in the early 1800s, who observed anomalous energy coming off a disk consisting of magnets, that there exists a possibility of tapping this energy field and creating, quote, free energy, which isn't really free energy, but it seems free to us now. Just like when the water wheel was developed, and the water wheel took advantage of water falling because of gravity, well, then it was possible then to have textile mills and all sorts of things to generate power and other forms of energy that were useful to us. Well, you can also dip that paddle wheel into the zero-point field. And that's exactly what physicists are doing and other inventors and other individuals. And the state of the art of this thing we call free energy, or zero-point energy, is a lot further along than you would ever imagine. As I've often said, the Wright brothers have flown on this one. We're just not delivering the mail yet and passengers. And yet there is this incredible resistance to the concept among some physicists that take 1 microsecond to look at it and say,
this is perpetual motion. We all realize there is no such thing. Moreover, hot fusion is a very exemplary approach because $1 billion is spent every year. And there's nothing spent on cold fusion because it can't be, because it violates the laws of physics.
I have fun with them because, it's just... And anyway, you kind of get it, is that there's this big clash. And meanwhile, there's been a media blackout on this. I had an interview, a 3-hour-long interview with a reporter from the Washington Post. It was actually the editor of the style section, I guess it was. I think it was the style section. And I don't know. It couldn't be the science editor because, you see, the science editors ran things by Carl Sagan and others, and they would say, no, there's no way. And, it never sees the light of day. The 3-hour interview was never published, but he wrote a safe historical curiosity piece on Tesla. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Nikola Tesla, the great pioneer 100 years ago around the turn of this waning century, who was able to demonstrate some of these principles and concepts. And as soon as he was able to demonstrate them, his funding source, J.P. Morgan, who was the great Lapis Pig, and who owned all the copper mines, and ironically, he owned the copper mines and created the wires in this grid system, which I sometimes call the electric jail, not only polluting electronically or electromagnetically polluting, but also visually polluting, all these silly wires that pipe electricity. And that actually, these energy sources that we're talking about in free energy are actually virtually infinite. And Tesla discovered this. J.P. Morgan cut his funding off, so much for that. But then there were other pioneers early this century, T. Henry Murray and others, who have also developed some of these things. Murray was shot at, was actually injured by a bullet once. His machine was totally demolished. There's been enormous suppression, there's been enormous secrecy in this whole area, much more so even than the UFO question. Because you see, in the UFO question at least, some people look at the sky and they see UFOs. And so that's an area that it's a little more in the public domain. But the area of so-called free energy or zero-point energy has been very suppressed and continues to be suppressed by the media, by academe, and of course, this is exactly what you'd expect when there's about to be a paradigm shift. Great sociologist of science, Thomas Kuhn, one time, it was a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution, said that the paradigm will shift, is most likely to shift in the times when you have this incredible polarization building up. But in fact, the concept of zero-point energy is alive and well. We have a number of different forms of so-called free energy. Someone would say free energy. There's, for example, low energy, we call low energy nuclear reactions, which is really cold fusion. Fascinating concept, and it's the one that's furthest along right now. Two University of Utah chemists, Stanley Pones and Martin Fleischmann, stumbled into this and found that a vessel of saline solution, when a certain palladium cathode was dipped into it, then anomalous energy came off, and they also found nuclear byproducts, such as tritium and helium. And these are the very things that shouldn't happen given the theories that we understand of nuclear physics. So nuclear physicists obviously were quite shaken by these results and just said, well, that can't be. It violates existing theories, therefore it doesn't exist. In fact, they jumped to that conclusion within a month of the time the discovery was announced. Meanwhile, laboratories all over the world were replicating it and creating their own experiments. And right now, the state of the art is growing very rapidly. I'd say the doubling time is about 1 year for the amount of anomalous results that are taking place. There's an excellent magazine called Infinite Energy, which, if you're interested in all this stuff, I suggest you subscribe to it. It gives you a kind of a monthly or bi-monthly state of the art of what's going on here. And there are many devices now that have been patented and are available in the marketplace. They're specialized devices used for handling nuclear materials and so forth. But this technology appears to not only be able to produce energy, quote, for free. In other words, you have one of these devices and you get it going, and it's free running for a while, and then you basically unplug it, and it just continues producing either electricity or heat. So you can imagine now, in the future, no longer having to be in the grid system. Your sign here can be lit from within. Probably the way we're going to go really is solid state, where electrons inside a magnet that's specially conditioned or a crystal device can resonate with the zero-point field, therefore creating energy. And these solid-state devices, which would have no moving parts, could be probably smaller than this eraser and could replace your circuit breakers and your automobile engines. No, you don't need internal combustion engines anymore. You don't need gas stations, power plants, oil refineries, supertankers, you name it, and it's gone. Can you imagine gas stations becoming restaurants? Instead of Victoria Station, you have, yeah, or you could have them dispensing water instead of oil, whatever. But this is probably the way we're going to go. This is probably the most elegant approach, and there are many, many different approaches to this. There's also rotating magnetic devices or rotating electromagnetic devices. These are all different types of technological approaches to this, and these have all yielded very positive results in creating so-called overunity power, which means more energy going out than in as measured by traditional means. But if you think of the analog of the paddle wheel, and you can imagine all of space being filled, seething with this potential energy, that all it has to do is be plucked and resonated with. Now, this has led me to think a little bit beyond that, saying, this is somewhat reminiscent of how consciousness works. And we all know there have been a lot of experiments now in what we would call consciousness across the boards, whether it's quantum physics or psychokinesis, and we're going to be talking about those experiments a little bit, or experiments, and these experiments, there have been many, many, many done. These, in addition to the so-called zero-point energy experiments, all told, seem to represent certain qualities in which either a human being or a device interacts in a nonlinear or accelerative fashion with this hypothesized field, thereby interacting with it and creating results in the material world. So, for example, in quantum physics, quantum mechanics, it's now familiar to all of us that certain paradoxes occur when we try to take a materialistic view of what happens. And that, in fact, what is happening is that in Western science is being turned on its ear by the fact that when you go into the laboratory to observe various phenomena, you find that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in some respects, that the observer will come in and there'll be some result that was not expected if you just didn't observe. And then, in fact, electromagnetic phenomena can be reduced to particles. In other words, the material universe exists only when we make an observation. That's the basic conclusion of quantum mechanics. When we're not looking, then it only exists as a probability. And this then raises the question about consciousness, is that, well, what are we doing? We're all kind of creating the universe that's out here. We create our own reality, in a way. And that's a rather radical conclusion, but one that's inevitable. And this has led then to a number of concepts. One of them is the question of instantaneousness. And in other words, this observer effect is instantaneous. And there have been a number of experiments done which, for example, involve observing two particles that spin, and then they're separated and they dance together, and the information is transmitted instantaneously, faster than the speed of light. It's non-local. And the third one is what we would call downward causing or downward causation. What does that mean? Well, it means that the phenomena of consciousness, as observed by the quantum physicists, are more important than trying to understand reality in terms of the component parts where they have these little billiard balls obeying certain immutable laws of physics. So we're going to break very shortly, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this.
I didn't catch that. Why is it
Downward causation means that the fundamental principle of the universe is consciousness. The consciousness is the ground of all being. And that if we start there and have derivatives from that, then the material universe falls out of consciousness. And it's actually created by consciousness.
So the downward being that it starts at consciousness?
Exactly. Whereas upward causation, which is the currently accepted Western science, starts with tiny little billiard ball particles that then build up to molecules and bigger things. Okay, so we're going to summarize here a little bit about quantum physics, is that the experiments in physics this century were very surprising, because instead of finding these little billiard balls that matter was composed of, that were inert and could be just obey certain immutable forces of physics, we instead found that the act of observation created the reality that we observed. And that has been shown time and time again. And the only plausible explanation for these phenomena, the only plausible explanation appears to be consciousness. In other words, the act of observation creates the physical reality that we're observing. And this really unsettles some people, because most scientists, of course, truly believe that if you walk away from something, it's still there. But it isn't. And it's more a wave of probability.
Get that pig out.
If you would like to know my opinion, everything that has been said tonight so far is total bunk. It's poppycock, because any prudent scientist would know that material reality, including monies, is to be optimized and dealt with in a business-like way. And this business of creating our own reality has nothing to do with it, and consciousness doesn't exist.
You see, this is how I grew up, so I have to, and that's how my colleagues still are. And anyway, but the characteristics, there have been some remarkable experiments and observations in quantum mechanics that show that the various operations between particles, whether it's their spin or whatever, for example, there was an experiment that showed two particles that spun in the same direction, and then they were separated by vast distance, and they still danced. They flipped their spin at exactly the same time, consuming no time whatsoever to communicate this. So you wonder, well, how did this ever get communicated? And of course, our normal way of thinking is, well, obviously it was the speed of light and there's some kind of force between the particles. Well, that force is consciousness, and that's what the physicists are beginning to tell us. And there's really been some good books written by physicists on this. One of them is called The Self-Aware Universe by Amit Goswami, theoretical physicist at the University of Oregon. And he talks about these characteristics comprising the phenomena of quantum mechanics to reconcile these anomalies and paradoxes that come out in a materialistic explanation. The fact is, though, what's happening is the fabric of the universe is such that phenomena occur consuming no time, and it's no respecter of distance either. And there have been some really good experiments done on psychokinesis, biocommunications. I'm going to start to write a few of these down, and I'll explain each one. Let's see, what else? It's just a lot of course, mind over matter, remote viewing. These are experiments within the field of what we call parapsychology. Psychologists were the first ones to kind of enter this realm. And psychokinesis is another approach to this question of consciousness that seem to have the same characteristics. And psychokinesis is basically mind over matter. And it was interesting because at Princeton, while I was starting to sneak off and do metaphysical workshops on the weekends, I didn't tell my colleagues I was doing that. Over in the engineering department, Robert John, the dean of the School of Engineering, was clandestinely doing experiments in his basement on psychokinesis. And these involve the use of what's called random event generators. These are little black boxes that spit out numbers, ones or zeros, and then an observer goes in the laboratory and tries to influence the result of this black box. And what they found was that virtually everybody has some psychic signature and can actually determine results of these machines. In other words, they're non-random results. And the effects are very small, like 1 part in 1,000. But then what they found, and other experimental groups more recently found, was that bonded couples working on these same machines are on the average able to be 7 times more effective in getting non-randomness. And even larger effects when groups come together for the purpose of satsang, or prayer, or humor. Whereas a board meeting is very boring. There they didn't get any results at all. There's a group, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, that actually one time put one of these random event generators in a room with a TV set that was showing the Academy Awards, where 1 billion people were watching it. And there they were getting some very non-random results. In other words, there is a tendency to cohere when groups come together for the purpose of prayer and humor. And let's face it, it's prayer and humor is what's, makes life fun. Because then we can create miracles, and we all know that. And there are a number of experiments that have been done. So psychokinesis, what I'm going to say is that there's John et al. At Princeton, wonderful experiments. There's also a group called Spindrift. Their results are very important. These were former Christian Science practitioners that did all sorts of double-blind studies on the power of prayer. And they found that prayer was very, very effective. And and one of the double-blind studies, for example, were for heart patients. And one group was prayed for and the other group wasn't. And the group that was prayed for did far better. Both groups were administered standard allopathic cardiological treatment. There are a number of other experiments that Spindrift did. It's very unfortunate. And by the way, I have to say that in free energy, psychokinesis, and some of these areas that are outside the box, the scientists themselves, the investigators, have had really rough lives. Many of these people go into deep depression. Some of them have committed suicide. You better believe that things right now are going on in this planet right now, very similar to the time of the Renaissance, when people like Bruno and Galileo were going against the grain. When you go against the grain of the cultural norm, it becomes very difficult. And Spindrift, the fellows here, the Christian Science Church basically dropped them from their practitioner list because their belief system was that the efficacy of the power of prayer was already proven by Mary Baker Eddy, so why even try to scientifically verify it? So you see what's happening is we have these boxes, these belief systems, this tapestry of reality that's this patchwork quilt of belief systems where it's very difficult for existing institutions or established groups of belief to accept things that might go against the tenets of their already existing beliefs. And add that to the fact that there's not $1 federal or state funding for any of these investigations, and it's no wonder. These gentlemen at Spindrift who did commit suicide, they were virtually unrecognized in their time, and yet their experiments were very important. They've done some of the John et al. And Spindrift and Radin et al. At University of Nevada, Las Vegas. All of these people are real pioneers, and their experiments I consider to be very important because these experiments underlie a repeating way that humans can learn, that humans do in fact have influence in the material world, can actually literally move electrons in a different direction. So you can imagine technological gizmos which would be extensions of our own consciousness or thinking. So it's more than just talking about the power of prayer and the power of thought, but actually creating those results in the material world. So virtual reality is more than just a chamber that simulates exciting visuals, we get to create them. And that's, I think, a technology that will be underlying all of these others. These are all kind of related. And so we have these experiments in psychokinesis that are very important. There are experiments in what we call biocommunications or telepathy. Right here in San Diego, Cleve Baxter. How many of you have ever heard of Cleve Baxter? He was written up in The Secret Life of Plants. I talk about all of this work in my New Science trilogy of books. And Cleve Baxter did some very important experiments in which he actually hooked up an electrode of a lie detector to one of his plants and found that the plant responded electrically not to his watering of the plant, but to his thinking of watering the plant. And then this led to a number of other experiments between people and people in their own donated adedescent white blood cells, and they found that people's experienced emotions correlated with the electrical activity of the adedescent white blood cells that was donated in the saliva, spit into a test tube and put it over here. And these correlations were very striking. I've done some experiments with them in which that's was shown beyond any reasonable doubt. There's another concept in biology that we sometimes call morphic fields. This is a concept pioneered by the cell biologist from Cambridge University, Rupert Sheldrake. And the concept of morphic fields is a very interesting one, because what Sheldrake discovered, I'm sure many of you have heard of the 100th monkey fable, you know, the story where monkeys were learning how to wash their sweet potatoes in new ways, and for a while there was monkey see, monkey do, and until about 100 monkeys were doing it that way. And then all of a sudden, all the monkeys, not only in that island, but islands all over the place, were doing it in the new way, as if the consciousness spread. And of course, we often talk about that, about global transformation, that if enough of us focus on a positive result, then we'll get it. And this concept now has been studied in many biological systems by Rupert Sheldrake and others, and he's come up with many, quote, proofs or examples of this phenomenon actually operating. And it certainly applies to the human species as well as other species. And the general principle is that if a certain number of individuals from a given species, if a certain critical mass develops a new habit, then suddenly everybody's doing it that way as if it had been done all the time. And we see that that's how history changes sometimes, where if there's enough dedicated people to focus on a particular result, then that result, in fact, will happen. And so this is a very important concept in biology and biological systems. Another example in chemistry is alchemy. Now, a lot of us think, oh, alchemy doesn't exist. That's being able to make one material into another, to spin something into gold. I mean, this is something the Lapis Pig would like, but he would say, of course,
there is no such thing as alchemy. There's the standard laws of nuclear physics, such as the hydrogen bomb and other devices. That's quite possible, of course, but there is no such thing as alchemy or cold fusion.
But there is. That's what we're beginning to find. In other words, there are these low-energy nuclear reactions that are taking place in a number of experiments that involve various chemical systems, such as the Pons and Fleischmann system and a number of other systems. And what's happening is that not only are there unusually great amounts of energy coming out of some of these systems, but also some of the elements that comprise these systems are combining with one another to form heavier elements. There are some scientists now that have actually been able to render nuclear radioactive waste harmless as a result of this process. And so the technology in principle exists already to neutralize or remediate nuclear waste. So these are all kind of related topics which are all pointing toward the efficacy of consciousness being the ground of all being, the most general case of science. And then this leads one into all sorts of new cosmologies too. How many of you are familiar with Einstein's theory of special relativity? Can you quote the equations? No, just kidding. That's right, this isn't Caltech. Well, some of you probably have heard of the clock paradox, where if you take a trip into space and you go at near the speed of light, and you can accelerate yourself to near the speed of light, but not quite, because then your mass becomes infinite. Well, according to the theory of special relativity, then you come back and you could be younger than your grandchildren. You might take a trip that for you took just a few years or months, and the folks back here, meanwhile, experience decades, because your measurement of time is different, because there's a relativistic effect. Well, this is an interesting concept, and the scientist Peter Russell took this idea and kind of played it with it, and I've played with it a little bit too. And it's really interesting because if you are going the speed of light, which of course a photon or a unit of light actually does, let's say like going from the sun to the earth, it takes 9 minutes for that photon of light to go from the sun to the earth as we measure it, because it goes 186,000 miles a second. It's in the sun, and then it goes to the earth. Okay, during that period of time, the light, from the point of view of light, think about this. If you're going the speed of light, then you're there and here at the same time, according to special relativity. So that means that you're there and everywhere in the universe at the same time. So all space and time no longer exists. It just is. There's an isness of light. And of course, this is, according to mystical traditions, is what light and consciousness is all about. And this leads one to then hypothesize, well, maybe we're dealing here with two different realms. The material realm, the realm in which our three-dimensional universe here in the Earth, where we're a bunch of pigs and particles walking around in time and space, obeying certain immutable forces of physics, that might be a limiting case of a more general reality in which consciousness is the ground of all being, and the realm of light is the most fundamental reality, and that the material world is simply a kind of how should I say it? It falls out of light and causes us to have the illusion of separation and materialism and time and space. But all of those quantities no longer become real from the point of view of light. From the point of view of light, you're everywhere at once. There is no time. There is no space. There just is. And that's the oneness. And that's then what leads us to some concepts like the holographic universe, where the whole contains the parts and the parts contain the whole. And it's sort of like turning anything inside out and outside in. A remarkable concept, but one that physicists observe all the time in their normal routine. But it's counterintuitive because we still seem to want to stay inside the box, but all of these things combined are beginning to show us, now wait a minute, there exist all of these ways that we can communicate with one another, and ways that we can measure particles and various macro phenomena like electrons moving in new directions as a result of the human interaction, that we are dealing with the foundation of a whole new science of consciousness. And that science is coming along a lot faster than a lot of people realize. The science is so bold and so different from what we have now that I think that we're dealing institutionally with many of the same problems that we dealt with in the time of the Renaissance, when, for example, there was the Catholic Church on the one hand, and on the other hand we had these renegade individuals like Galileo and Bruno. Bruno was burned at the stake for believing there might be extraterrestrial intelligence, and that that the Earth may not be at the center of everything after all. And similar things are going right now. People are not burned at the stake literally, but they're excluded from the fraternal institutions of mainstream America and the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the fabric of science is getting ripped by these various anomalous results. But it's not only the sciences. Of course, we have medicine, and this is probably the area that is best developed. In other words, alternative health and healing. You know, we all realize there's more to the human body than just being some kind of like car that has systems that run out, and we can cut them and drug them and take care of things either through surgery or through chemical drugs. And that's all there is, folks. That's the only way we can heal. We realize that there are many, many other ways we can heal, and that consciousness is one way to do it. That's what created, of course, the popularity of Deepak Chopra and many other physicians who have now gotten into alternative health and healing. And this is an area that's probably much further along the mind-body medicine than any of these other areas, and has certainly been more publicized and more looked at by individuals. And through the modalities and means of this form of medicine, we're dealing with something that's quite remarkable and quite highly developed. Yes, Harry?
My thinking, and I'm curious about your input on this, is we have watched in this decade, I mean literally in the last 6 or 7 years, in this paradigm of medicine and the acceptance of alternative healing. We've seen what you were talking about earlier, this doubling happening so rapidly. I mean, in your view, we must be headed, in my view, we must be headed toward a doubling in these other areas.
Absolutely. And what's happening is that this is leading the way. The medicine is a little further along, and that's in part because of the individuals choose to look at these alternative methods. And just in your being here tonight means that you're looking at these other methods of healing and health. And that's great, because that provides then the edge of a wedge of some of these other modalities of consciousness that are also being observed by scientists pretty much across the board of disciplines. We also have philosophy, the discipline of philosophy. Now, Carl Jung, when he was on his deathbed, he deplored and lamented the state of philosophy. He said, our philosophy is so bad, it does not even posit the existence of a soul which endures the human lifespan. That in fact we're dealing with a very materialistic philosophy. It's based almost entirely on the Cartesian model of objective materialism. And most philosophers, if they're going to get a professorship at a university, believe that, and they assume that's the case. Now there's a rip in the fabric of philosophy, and David Chalmers, who's University of California, Santa Cruz, wrote a book called The Conscious Mind, and that is now just really rocking the whole field of philosophy. He's basically saying, as if he's doing a eureka here. I mean, even though we've known this for a long time in the field of metaphysics, which after all is a branch of philosophy, but has not been looked at. The metaphysics that most mainstream philosophers look at is just the objective materialism. But in fact, consciousness from a philosopher's point of view is the subjective experience of self-existence or self-awareness, which cannot be explained in the Newtonian, Cartesian, three-dimensional matter-energy model. You have to go beyond that. And it's almost like Chalmers made this incredible discovery. Most philosophers, though, base these precepts of consciousness on the observations of quantum physics because they've been around for a while and they've been mainstreamed. Whereas psychokinesis, biocommunications, morphic fields, alchemy, and alternative medicine are still areas that have been kind of given short shrift by virtually all mainstream academics. So that's why we have this rather jaundiced view of reality that's dished out by the scientists, by the media, by the government, funding the scientists that only do materialistic things. One maybe small exception to that is the Office of Alternative Medicine in the National Institutes of Health. And I think they get about $1 million a year, which is something like 1,000th of 1% of the federal budget for research and development. Most everything else is plowed into things like nuclear energy and weapons of mass destruction and Star Wars and all that wonderful stuff that the federal government dishes out these days. Now, moving right along here, and we talked about the Earth and the problem we've had about fission and oil, the use of oil, the fact that we've tripled our oil consumption over the last 2 decades, the fact that the Kyoto Accords are too little too late. All these politicians are self-congratulatory. Even Al Gore, who's very environmental, still doesn't quite get it, that trying to get our fossil fuel consumption back to the 1990 levels by the year 2010 probably won't work. And we're dealing with a very serious problem here. So that the oil problem and the nuclear problem, the fact that we have radioactive waste from nuclear power, that we have, I drove by San Onofre coming down here, and I kind of feel a little, when I look at it, you can't see it or smell it, but there could be radioactivity, that meltdown. sitting on a fault, all that kind of stuff, China syndrome. All of these things, the fact that Pakistan and India now have nuclear bombs, one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day, and it's much more than that. It's obviously a very dangerous technology. Now, free energy technology can also be dangerous if it were abused. And so it seems like now, in terms of ethics, which is another branch of philosophy that's sometimes not adequately treated by philosophers, that if we look at the ethics of all of this, we must face the issue about the abuse of technology. We must be able to look at each technology and what its benefits are and its problems, and be able to anticipate what's going to happen. So although I am a free energy advocate, I'm also one that would want to move into it cautiously so that it's dished out in bite-sized portions so that we don't have bigger power saws and more massive jackhammers. Have you noticed noise pollution has gone up? I've noticed that. I haven't been in the megalopolis for many years, and every time I come back it's even a little worse. It's just a frog in the pond. All of these things have to be looked at in their ethical dimensions. And just as important, of course, is looking at the god that's worshipped by the Western culture, which is the economy. Now, the economy is something that the Lapis Pig worships.
I would like to offer the following. The current industrial infrastructure is quite fine. And the economic implications are fine. We have unprecedented prosperity and prudent profiteering by plutocratic, perspicacious, optimized profits.
Yeah, so the Lapis Pig is going on. I have a cousin who's a bank president, and he one time told me,
Brian, while your form of energy may be feasible, there's no way to implement it for at least another 20 years.
And his reasoning there is that if we were to implement free energy, then existing energy infrastructure of oil, utilities, and so forth, that there'd be economic collapse. Because we've not only set our current priorities, we've mortgaged our future priorities. And my cousin very logically argued that the economy, such as we now know it, won't last unless we phase it in very gradually and not even begin to do it for another 20 years. And that's what my cousin said. That's really gloomy news. It says, well, do we have to buy into a belief system where that's so? Meanwhile, the Earth goes down the tubes? Or can we find ways of transforming the current economy into a new economy that is based on these new sources and a new type of abundance and prosperity? And these are very important issues, the economics, the ethics. We have to look at also this media blackout that's happening now with these alternatives. It seems right now that we're more focused on Armageddon and business as usual than we are with looking at solutions. Now, I was a part of the Apollo program, and there was a can-do attitude. Kennedy got up there very dramatically and set the lunar landing goal, and indeed it happened within schedule and budget. And now we're dealing with something where the Earth and we need to look at alternatives, and they're simply not being considered. But the good news about all of this is that necessity is a mother of invention. And as catastrophes accelerate, as El Nino gets worse and harder, the day will come when certain numbers of us, first small numbers, maybe in a town meeting type of format, will start to debate these issues for what they are. And I'm working on a new book. The subtitle is 12 Ways to Re-inherit the Earth. This is the last part of the presentation, and I'm going to be talking about some ideas that I think whose time has come. Ideas, technologies first, and also individual things that we can do that are more focused on solutions rather than problems. Because I think we've been dwelling on our problems. We've either been dwelling on our problems and saying, oh, what's the use, or going back to business as usual for personal gain perhaps, but not for the betterment of humankind. And I've developed a few ideas. I call them Well, the 12 ideas are as follows. One of them, which is obvious, is to develop free energy. You know, it's high time now we recognize that there are enough experiments out there that the genie is out of the bottle, and no amount of suppression or secrecy is going to stop that. So that's one idea. And these are what I would call the new technologies for a clean, green Earth. The second one is to create a new physics of consciousness, to call a spade and say, well, okay, the only plausible way to explain these anomalies in quantum mechanics is consciousness. And so that would be another idea. Another is to purify our waterways. There exist technologies based on some of the work of Marcel Vogel and others. We see examples of this like in Lourdes in France. There are ways that you can spin water around the energy field of a crystal, and believe it or not, the water comes out better. And I've done a number of experiments that show this is indeed the case. And there are a number of people working in this field. We don't hear about this in the news. But these are things that can purify our waterways, clean up water pollution, and also allow us to preserve fluids without the use of chemical additives. These are some of the technologies of consciousness which are coming along. Another is to create a sustainable future for the Earth, agriculturally, in terms of our forests, in terms of our use of resources. It's high time we did that. Instead of knocking down trees for paper, why not use hemp? Hemp is a very, very reasonable alternative for clothing as well. There's no reason why we can't go to that economy, no reason why we can't preserve our forests and leave them the way they are, and let nature set its own course. So another area is the area of the universal, what I call the universal human and the cosmos. My friend Gary Zukav is writing a book called The Universal Human, and we are evolving as well as concepts that are on the table to sustain ourselves on the Earth. And some of the new things that we can look for in the future, certainly expanding our healing paradigm. You know, it's time to get beyond the cut 'em and drug 'em syndrome and to get right into alternative medicine, prayer, and some of those modalities to expand our healing paradigm. Another is to rebuild our spirits. There's so much stress out there. It seems like the rate of change of everything is accelerating and people are just buzzing around like a bunch of bees. Sometimes I see the megalopolis like a beehive. And it doesn't have to be that way. I know I've had some of my health problems which have forced me to look at some of the modalities of spirit. I've, for example, gotten into yoga big time, and that's really saved my body from quite a bit of abuse. But there are many other ways too. Come to the New Thought Center. That's a great way to rebuild your spirits. Another idea is research our own immortality. In other words, we are more than just these assemblages of stuff that exists for a few decades and then we keel over and we're dead and that's the whole thing. There's a tremendously good research being done on the near-death experience, on spirit communication, on reincarnation. All of these subjects which have been taboo in a court of scientific inquiry are subjects that can be addressed, I believe, scientifically with the same degree of rigor of any other area. I want to know what's going to happen after I die. And we have such a fear of death and we're in such denial about it. Another area, discover and contact non-human intelligence. And by non-human intelligence, I mean not only aliens that would attack us on Independence Day or from a companion to Hale Bopp. You know, there's so much sensationalistic stuff out there. Most of it's garbage. But we can look at this from a scientific perspective. There is certainly a lot to the UFO phenomenon. There's a lot to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in non-traditional ways, more than just radio telescopes and listening to signals in the radio region of the spectrum coming from planets circling nearby stars. That's the traditional mainstream astronomer's approach, but there are many other approaches. I've been very involved in this field called planetary SETI, looking at some of the anomalies on Mars. Tonight I don't have time to go into details on that except to say that the fat lady hasn't sung on the question of the face on Mars. There's a recent book out that's out in the lobby that describes, it was a collection of articles by a number of us PhD types that have done a lot of research, and we have not really resolved that issue yet, even though NASA would want you to believe that there's nothing to it. And that's on one end of the spectrum. The other, Richard Hoagland would say that, NASA's covering up and there's a lot of secrecy and the face really is artificial. And I think the truth is neither of the above. We need to be open to all hypotheses of reality. And we need to be open to the fact that any kind of discovery of non-human intelligence, whether it's angels, aliens, dolphins, Gaia herself, nature spirits, any manifestation of it, crop circles, is going to be bizarre by our standards. And for us to try to mock up what this is going to be like is what it would be like for a bushman to behold a Coke bottle or a 747 flying overhead. What do you make? I mean, maybe you can think about some civilization with bigger spears or that builds bigger fires, but they couldn't even conceive of things like television or nuclear weapons or so forth. So it's very anthropocentric for us to presume we know how non-human intelligence will manifest. And the fact is that in this field it's very complex and requires, I think, our best scientific thinking. And most scientists, of course, are unwilling to touch that whole subject with a 400,000-foot pole for fear they're going to lose their jobs or their research grants. And believe me, I've seen many examples of that refusal to look at that among mainstream scientists. I know because I was one. Finally, we have social inventions for the new millennium. Build community and communicate. I see that in the information age that we have now, which, by the way, is also a disinformation age, garbage in, garbage out. And there's a lot of garbage in this ivory tower Babel that we live in. But we have the capability now through the internet and other extremely high-speed, efficient communications to build global networks so that information can be exchanged. A wonderful example of that was the group in our group called the Society for Planetary SETI Research. There are 20 of us PhD types led by a philosophy professor, Stan McDaniel. And we were in contact by email when the Mars Global Surveyor pictures of the face on Mars came in. And we had 2,700 email exchanges within 2 or 3 weeks. We were like a cyber faculty, connected in thought. And that's all part of what I think is what New Thought is about, is being able to create the means to do scientific research in a much shorter time scale in a much more efficient way. And I could still be sitting on the beach in Hana at my computer, smelling the surf and hearing it while I'm communicating with my colleagues all over the world. Community, that's very important. We have kind of built these fences and walls around us in the so-called nuclear family, which is breaking down in a lot of ways. I think we're going to have to look more toward concepts of community, and that's your community right here. And the New Thought Center is a community. And it's really nice to drop in on these communities and see how close you all are and how through the years you get even closer and closer, and that's exactly the way it ought to be. And sometimes being the global person I am, flitting here and there, I kind of miss that. But some of us, I guess, are ambassadors, and some of the rest of us are these nodal points of communications globally. So communication and community work together, I think, to create a whole new information age, and will be able to allow us to disseminate the truth for what it is rather than what we are mocking it up to be. We want to create an economy based on ecology rather than on just profits, optimizing profits and creating new wealth by screwing up the earth. We have seen so many cases of where that has not happened. There are going to need to be public policies that will allow us to move into an era of economics, a combination of economics, and where the resources of the earth are given value rather than just something to be wasted and despoiled and thrown away for the purpose of profit. We'd like to form an enlightened world government. We're not talking about the New World Order here. We're talking about a world government by consent where wise individuals can guide these new policies and changes. Something like a council of elders, for example, rather than the kinds of governments we have now, which seem to be based on nation states which compete for power, resources, and prestige. And finally, we would like to look for humane ways to manage our population. Now, China has one model. It's one that's rather intimidating, but one can think about doing this maybe in terms of incentives rather than disincentives. In other words, if you have one kid, get some kind of kickback. If you have 2 kids, less of a kickback. If you have 3 kids, less, whatever. Another would be space settlements. Moves, some people that want to go to war or whatever they want to do, let them go in space and do it. But let's return the Earth to Eden, to this wonderful green place that's always been. Now, I don't think these changes are going to be easy. Nothing is ever easy. No big change is easy. And there are these vested interests, these Lapis Pigs, who are resisting change at every turn. But a lot of sociologists now are beginning to talk about the postmodern or the post-industrial age, which is inevitably coming. I think it's going to be more than post-industrial. I think it's going to be an age of consciousness. And that's the really good news. But the path from here to there isn't easy. I as one example, have been experiencing some of these future shock of change feelings. When I was in Ashland, Oregon, and I wrote my most recent book, Miracle in the Void, the book was first going to be a photojournalistic look at the state of the art of free energy, a very noble cause and one that's quite feasible. And in fact, I did that. I traveled the world. I went to Japan, India, New Zealand, Europe, all over North America, and visited the best and brightest inventors and other scientists in the field of free energy. And that was cool. But what happened was, as I got more and more into it, when I began to realize the enormous implications of shifting the entire world economy, which is our God that we worship, the economy, the almighty dollar, optimizing profits, and so forth, that we're going to have to change that to a whole new way of thinking, one that involves energy sources that are not expendable or not non-renewable resources like oil or nuclear fuel, that we're going to be dealing with whole new technologies or approaches to these questions. In fact, I can envision devices that are basically free in your off-the-grid system. So what's going to happen to the oil companies? What's going to happen to the utilities? These are all, it's going to displace people from this thing we call jobs. So therefore, it's going to force us to redefine what is meant by a job, what is meant by the economy. These are the kinds of issues that really need to be discussed as the new begins to unfold. I think that what we're going to find out is most of the things that we really need are basically free. And that then frees us and allows us not to be so lockstepped into an industrial model. And this post-industrialism and the onset of consciousness, where that eventually we're going to realize we're very powerful creators and that we do indeed create our own reality and that we are our own free energy machines, that this will cause a grieving process. And the structure of Miracle in the Void was precisely that. That at first we're going to deny the new reality. It doesn't exist, it can't exist, therefore it isn't. And this has happened throughout all of time, of course. We realize when there are any radical changes ahead, the first reaction is to deny the change, shoot the messenger. We don't want to hear about it. Life is just fine. I'm making my salary. Leave me alone. I want to watch television. So those things are, when we begin to realize the importance of all this, then that is where the anger sets in. Anger usually comes after denial. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross did some great work on death and dying, on the grieving process, and found that most human beings experience a normal gamut of emotions in adjusting to either a death sentence by a doctor, you have terminal cancer, or a loved one is gone all of a sudden. Then you go through these emotions. First, denial, it couldn't have happened. Then comes anger. The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. I have that bumper sticker, and it was written by a Unity minister, so I feel I can say that but in this company. But that certainly is a very, very common thing, is to be very angry, and to be angry at those that perpetuated or perpetrated this deception. And indeed, there's been so much suppression of alternatives, for example, in our use of energy, and so much suppression of the UFO question, and so many other questions that are deeply and philosophically so important. Suppression of really good research in the area of our immortality, suppression of alternative health and healing. And when we get beyond the denials and the suppressions, that's when we kind of get angry. And we have to realize that that is a normal part of the grieving process. So we need to allow ourselves to be angry, to express it, and move through it. And I hope it can be done in a constructive way and that we don't have some sort of violent revolution. That's not what I want to see. And so we can pray for that. We can pray that the transition, that we can help ourselves and help one another move through these emotions, these phases that are very normal in a grieving process. Then beyond anger comes bargaining. Can we fit the new ideas within old structures? And the answer is no. Sorry, you can't fit round pegs in square holes and vice versa. And so when that happens, very often then we get depressed. And many of the pioneers of new energy, that's what I found, were depressed. And many of them died early deaths. Many of them have been unsupported. Many of them have gotten very eccentric and have tried to pair up with investors. But the investor-inventor pairs, they're sort of like Lapis Pigs on the one hand and these wild eccentric geniuses on the other hand, and never the twain shall they meet. And so many of these people go into depression. I did too, and I have at times been quite depressed because not only does the world seem to be shifting as fast as I'd like to see it shift, given my egoic response to what's going on, but also it just seems like the shift is so enormous that how are we ever going to get it done? But then that's a mental process. But the depression very often happens. You try to bargain with God. Please reverse this death of this loved one. Please reverse the death of an old familiar way of doing things. But you see, it's going to happen anyway. Shift happens. And so we get depressed, and then some of us sink into despair, and thank God what happens is we finally get into a point of acceptance. And that's always the final phase of the grieving process, and then we can transform. And that's how the structure of the chapters in the book, Miracle in the Void, that's how they were structured, is I kind of went through my own emotions, and I clocked it with the emotions of those that were the pioneers in some of these new areas, of going from the denial to the anger, to the bargaining, to the depression, to the acceptance. But you see, when you finally accept the reality, then it's okay. Then you're able to expand your consciousness. And that's what's been happening with me, is I accept that there are these two coexisting realities, the old reality, the old paradigm, which is very much with us still on this planet, and the new paradigm, which is not going to resemble the old by any means, and will be the whole landmark of the third millennium as we enter it. You're going to see so many examples of consciousness being the ground of all being as we begin to evolve this new science of consciousness. So then we can become more enlightened. We can become empowered to make the changes that we want to make. And we can have joy doing it. And we can transcend. We can move and shift our consciousness to the next higher level. And I see that happening as individuals and collectively. I see miracles happening to make the world a much better place to be. And I do have a lot of hope in spite of Armageddon fever that we have these days, that we are truly on the threshold of extraordinary change in our culture. And I want to thank you for being patient and listening. Good evening.
If you would like to know my opinion, I hope the tape doesn't work. And there is absolutely nothing of any value in this lecture. And we will realize that the laws of physics do not permit these things happening.
I think we have a couple of minutes for a couple of questions here. Yes?
I I understand that the free energy devices are actually pretty simple to create. Would it be possible for you to briefly describe how it works? I'd love to make one myself.
Okay, yeah, the question is, how do you make a free energy device? And the answer is that it's not as simple as you would think. It takes money, it takes time. A lot of the inventors have found inconsistent results. It's sort of like the early days of aviation. You know, people blunder around and a few succeed and a few don't. The ones that generally succeed are either self-educated, brilliant geniuses that just never stop working, people like Edison or the Wright brothers, or they're people that are already very highly trained as physicists, and there are some in that category too, and have good funds to actually do some pretty good fundamental experiments. But it's kind of hard for the average person to just get right into it. There are some basic principles, and many of these machines, some of them involve rotating magnets, some of them are solid-state devices, some of them are cold fusion devices. There are many different approaches to the question. But many of these people, I'd say now to the tune of several thousand, have actually had successful experiments. But most of these devices cost anywhere from a few thousand to a few $1,000,000 to develop, to the point where, let's say, you have a viable research device that can be demonstrated to test engineers. And many of these devices are already available. There are also many commercial prototype devices and even a couple of commercial devices. The commercial device that's now available is called the Clean Energy Technology Patterson Fuel Cell, and it's used to handle radioactive materials. It costs $5,000 to rent one for a year. And it actually produces more energy than goes into it, but that's like a secondary aspect of it.
Isn't that device actually being accepted by the government and industry?
That's right. This particular device got a U.S. patent. One of the reasons why it got it is the Patent Office overlooked it. Now, the Patent Office consists of Lapis Pigs who say that there is no such thing as perpetual motion. I'll say it in my voice. There's no such thing as perpetual motion, and therefore prohibit anybody from patenting anything that smacks of that. Their prejudice is so strong. And the other problem with doing patents is that the big boys can buy you out or make a minor modification on your design and then run with it with their slick patent attorneys. And you see, right now we have a system where the big boys are very favored in just about every way. And the big boys are getting even bigger with all these mergers. So you have the big boys and the little boys. What I'd really like to see is an Apollo-type program, crash program to develop these energy sources and to have public funding of it and to have it in the open so that people know what's going on. I mean, it's time we mature about these things. It's time that we take the appropriate action so that we can, you know, get beyond this highly polluting age that we're in. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes?
You mentioned distant viewing. Was that the term?
Remote viewing.
What is that?
Remote viewing is the ability of a person to actually, when they're meditating, to be able to actually describe accurately some place, time, and event or person. Like, for example, one time a woman gave me the age of a man, his name, and the fact he was from Allentown, Pennsylvania. And I never met this man, but I had him pegged as a meteorologist, journalist that liked to spend a lot of time on the west coast of Maui and lost his wife by death. It was highly improbable. That turned out to be true, and I was amazed. That's the only real, true remote viewing experience I've had. And many people are doing research on this. Now, you hear from some people about this, and they call it scientific remote viewing, and you really think that they're doing a good job. There are a lot of charlatans in the field. That's part of the problem with all this stuff that I've been enumerating here, is that where there are many, many good researchers and legitimate researchers, there are also a lot of people that try to take advantage of it and make claims that are not substantiated. And of course that invites the skeptics to come in and really...
Isn't it true that the original remote viewing research was funded by the CIA?
Yes, some of the original remote viewing experiments were funded by the CIA. We don't know what's going on in the black budget, by the way. We really don't know. But there's a lot going on that we don't know about. And the question is, to what degree do we, as a, quote, democratic structure, tolerate this kind of activity at this point? Certainly it makes sense to be able to spy on potential enemies and all of that. Yeah, we all realize that, and that's the kind of CIA activity that's talked about in the media. But what about all this other stuff? What about things like remote viewing or the non-lethal weapon program that the Air Force and Army are conducting, which is really lethal weapons. These are just weapons that, psychic weapons, microwave weapons, laser weapons. All of these programs are going on in the black, and yet we wonder, well, for what purpose? Who's our enemy? I think we're going to have a whole cleaning out of the government, of industry, just about everything that people do. We're going to have to take a new look at it, and I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later. It may take some sort of catastrophe, natural or economic, to trigger all of this. But the fact is that will then force us into looking at these solutions. And to my way of thinking, why don't we start to examine the solutions now? Why don't we look at least conceptually what's possible to solve some of these challenges that we now have, rather than to wait until it's either too late or it's like an overreaction. So that's why I think it's so important we look at metaphysics, we look at consciousness, we look at what's happening in the sciences, and we try to put this data together in such a way that we can develop new agendas, new programs that will enhance the human condition and the condition of all life on the earth. In the end, I would love to see Earth return to Eden. Would love to see the air pollution cleaned up. Would love to see the global warming reversed. Would love to see the El Niños a little more under control, and that the Lapis Pig consciousness can sometime just kind of relax a little bit and allow these things to unfold the way they do, and to also for us to be able to accept with love and equanimity the fact that we are going through this paradigm shift, and it's kind of unsettling because there is a lot of fear and there is a lot of grieving going on, but there's also the room to transform. Well, yeah. Well, I have a simple answer to the question, how am I doing and how are my colleagues receiving it? It's a very simple four-word sentence, and that is, I have new colleagues. and you are my new colleagues. And I'm going over to England, by the way, in a couple of weeks, and I'll be over there for 3 or 4 months doing a pretty intense lecture tour. And we'll be doing the crop circles, and we'll be meeting many new colleagues there. There is a lot of activity going on. The metaphysical churches, like here, great place to be exposed to these ideas. Over in England, there's a scientific and medical network. There are a number of groups, the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And I just can't waste my time with my old colleagues. There was a professor at Caltech who I worked with very closely while I was there for a year while I was on sabbatical from Cornell, and that professor denied that I was ever there. And he tried to block my coming to Caltech, and he also denied many of my other credentials, things that actually happened. But that happens all the time, you see. There is this tremendous, but this happened in the Catholic Church. Carl Sagan, God rest his soul, he's a wonderful man, a great educator, but he was very, very opposed to metaphysical ideas. And, we had many clashes, and about all I can say is that, well, he's entitled to his opinion, but sometimes I call him Cardinal Sagan. Like the cardinals of the Catholic Church during the time of the Renaissance, the existing power structure got so powerful that it was able to hold sway over the whole of civilization until the ideas which really represent the truth shall set us free, were able to grab hold. But it took some generations before it really grabbed hold. So, it's going to be, things might get worse before they get better. I hate to say it. And I mean, the fact is that I haven't been able to penetrate the media one bit with the free energy idea. In fact, many reporters who were formerly friendly with me totally ignore me. So the mainstream is not where it's at. You can't, it's old wine in new bottles, and you just can't reform them. So what you do is just keep going after the truth and share with those that are willing to listen and to participate, and soon this new body of knowledge will happen, but it will probably be nurtured by whole new institutes and centers for new thought and networks. Anybody else, or shall we wrap this up soon? How are we doing?